Somewhere in a glass and steel building on the edge of Lake Geneva, there is a vault. Not a dramatic vault from a heist movie. No spinning gears, no laser grids. Just a quiet room, climate-controlled, monitored. And inside it, assets that belong to someone you will never meet, in a country they may never visit, earning returns that will never appear on any tax return you have ever seen. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is Tuesday in Switzerland. And the reason it works, the reason it has worked for over 500 years, is not because Switzerland is corrupt. It is not because they are hiding something shameful. It is because they built a system so legally airtight, so philosophically consistent, and so deeply woven into global finance that even the most powerful governments on Earth have tried to dismantle it and failed. Most of them quietly gave up. The question is not whether this system exists. It does. The question is why the world keeps feeding it, why the people who say they want to stop it usually benefit from it, and what that tells us about the way money actually works, not the way your economics textbook says it works, but the way it really works. Let us start at the beginning. The year is 1713. The Great Council of Geneva passes a law that will eventually reshape global finance. The law says that bankers must keep records of their clients, but they are forbidden from sharing those records with anyone, not other merchants, not foreign governments, not even the local authorities, unless a very specific set of conditions is met. At the time, this was mostly about protecting wealthy French aristocrats who were parking their money in Geneva to avoid the financial chaos of Louis XIV's France. The logic was simple. Geneva was small. Its only real asset was its reputation for discretion. Break that trust once, and the money leaves. The money leaves, and Geneva becomes just another cold city on a lake. So they made trust into law. They did not just promise confidentiality, they codified it. They made violating it a criminal offense. A banker who leaked a client's name was not sued, he was prosecuted. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Because when you make secrecy a matter of criminal law rather than civil agreements, you completely change the calculus for anyone who might pressure a banker to talk. A subpoena from a foreign government means nothing if the banker faces a Swiss criminal charge the moment he complies. Suddenly, Switzerland is not being uncooperative, Switzerland is just following its own laws, and no country can override another country's domestic criminal code. This is the genius of the original design. Inversions of it have survived, adapted, and multiplied for 300 years. By the 1930s, Switzerland had turned this philosophy into something much more formal. In 1934, the Swiss Federal Banking Act was passed. Article 47 of that law made it a criminal offense, punishable by prison, to disclose any information about a bank client's identity or finances. History books often say this law was created to protect Jewish depositors from Nazi Germany, which was pressuring Swiss banks to reveal which German citizens were hiding assets abroad. That narrative is romantic. It's also partially true, but the full picture is more complicated. Swiss banks at this point were also sheltering assets for some of the very regimes that were destabilizing Europe. Money does not have politics, it has gravity. It flows towards safety, and Switzerland had made itself the safest place on Earth to store it, for everyone, regardless of who they were or why they needed to disappear. The 1934 law gave that arrangement the force of federal law. It was not a choice, it was a wall. Now here's where it gets interesting. After World War II, the entire global financial system was redesigned at Bretton Woods. The United States became the anchor of global reserve currency. The dollar was king, and with that power came an assumption. America could pressure smaller nations into financial transparency when it needed to. They were mostly right, except with Switzerland. Switzerland was not a military power. It had no colonies, no empire, no seat on the UN Security Council. What it had was something more durable: neutrality as a brand. Swiss neutrality was not passive. It was not the neutrality of a country that couldn't afford to pick sides. It was the neutrality of a country that decided its competitive advantage was being the only place everyone trusted precisely because it was not beholden to any single power. And that brand extended naturally to its banks. You want to know what Switzerland was essentially selling? It was selling the idea that your money could exist outside of politics, outside of wars, outside of whoever happened to be winning or losing on the global stage this decade. That's an extraordinarily compelling product, and almost every kind of buyer you can imagine bought it. Wealthy families fleeing instability in South America, Middle Eastern oil fortunes seeking diversification, European nobility with assets they did not want showing up in estate records, American corporations looking to park profits in holding structures that reduced their tax exposure, Russian oligarchs a few decades later, and then, eventually, simply anyone wealthy enough to want a layer of distance between themselves and the question of what they owned. Switzerland took all of it. Let us talk about how the modern system actually works, because most people have a vague idea that Swiss banks are secretive, but they do not understand the architecture of why. When a wealthy individual or a corporation opens an account or establishes a relationship with a Swiss private bank, the account is often not held in their name. It is held through a structure, usually a trust, a foundation, or a shell company established in a jurisdiction like Liechtenstein, the British Virgin Islands, or the Cayman Islands. That entity is the legal account holder. The human behind it, the beneficial owner, is recorded privately, known to the bank, but not visible on any public registry. The bank in Switzerland then manages the assets on behalf of the structure. The structure has no public face. The bank's records are protected by Swiss banking secrecy law, and the jurisdiction where the shell company is registered has its own layers of privacy protection. What you have created is a nested system of opacity. Pull back one layer and you find another. Each layer is individually legal, each layer is in a different country, each country's laws insulated from the others, and the whole structure sits on a foundation of Swiss criminal law that makes the banker who holds the key legally obligated to stay silent. This is not a loophole. This is by design. Now, to be fair, Switzerland has changed, and those changes are real. They're just not quite what they look like from the outside. The pressure started building seriously after 2008. The global financial crisis made governments desperate for revenue, and suddenly the idea of trillions of dollars sitting untaxed in Swiss accounts looked a lot less like an abstract policy disagreement and a lot more like money that governments needed. The United States went after UBS, one of the largest banks in the world, in 2009. It accused it of helping American citizens hide assets from the IRS. It was one of the most aggressive legal assaults ever launched against Swiss banking secrecy. The case was a direct confrontation between American legal authority and Swiss domestic law. Switzerland blinked, sort of. UBS paid a $780 million fine. A list of account holders was eventually handed over, about 4,500 names. The U.S. had originally demanded 52,000. Switzerland provided 4,500 and called it cooperation. The American government accepted it and called it a victory. Both sides went back to their corners. Then came FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, passed in 2010. Required foreign financial institutions to report on accounts held by American citizens or face a 30% withholding tax on their U.S.-sourced income. It was a blunt instrument: pay us information or lose access to the U.S. financial system. This worked better. Swiss banks started reporting, agreements were signed, bilateral information-sharing treaties began accumulating. And here's where the official story and the real story diverge. The official story is that Swiss banking secrecy is over, that the era of hidden money is finished, that the global crackdown worked. The real story is more interesting. What actually happened is that Switzerland adapted again. The information-sharing agreements that were signed mostly cover automatic exchange with treaty partners, countries that have a formal agreement with Switzerland. That sounds comprehensive until you ask how many countries have full information-sharing treaties with Switzerland. The answer is fewer than you think. And the agreements that do exist have significant exclusions around older accounts, complex structures, and beneficial ownership that runs through multiple jurisdictions. Meanwhile, Switzerland did something quietly brilliant. It began positioning itself not as the place where you hide money, but as the place where you manage money. There's a difference, and the difference is largely semantic, but it matters legally. The wealth management industry in Switzerland manages somewhere between $2 and $3 trillion in assets. The Swiss Bankers Association puts the total assets under management in Switzerland, including those booked domestically and those from foreign clients, at figures that consistently rank among the highest of any country in the world. Depending on the estimate you trust, Switzerland manages somewhere between 25 and 30% of all cross-border private wealth globally. That number hasn't collapsed since the transparency reforms. It has remained roughly stable, which tells you something. The money didn't leave, it restructured. There's also a dimension to this that rarely gets discussed in the conversation about Swiss banking, and it's the most uncomfortable part. Governments that publicly pressure Switzerland for transparency are often simultaneously benefiting from the same system. Consider the following. The United Kingdom, which has made significant noise about global financial transparency, is the center of a network of crown dependencies and overseas territories: Jersey, Guernsey, the Isle of Man, the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, that collectively constitute one of the most sophisticated secrecy infrastructure systems in the world. British politicians have campaigned against Swiss banking, while British-linked jurisdictions housed the very shell companies that made Swiss banking structures possible. The United States, which extracted concessions from Switzerland with FATCA, does not itself participate in the Global Common Reporting Standard, the international framework it helped design to force other countries into automatic information exchange. America demands transparency from Switzerland, but does not reciprocate it. Delaware, South Dakota, and Nevada have become increasingly attractive to international wealth for exactly the kind of opacity that Swiss accounts supposedly no longer provide. This is the absurdity underneath the policy theater. The countries demanding Switzerland open its vaults are often the countries supplying the locks. And Switzerland knows this. It always has, which is why Swiss officials, when they want to cut through diplomatic niceties, tend to point to these contradictions with a calmness that is somehow more damning than outrage. Zoom out far enough, and here's what you're really looking at. The global financial system has a two-tiered structure. There's the visible economy, the GDP figures, the tax revenues, the regulated markets where most transactions happen and most people live. And then there's the offshore economy, a parallel system where a significant portion of global wealth circulates in structures designed to minimize friction with governments, regulators in the countries where that wealth was actually generated. Estimates of how much wealth sits in this parallel system vary wildly because, by definition, it's hard to measure. The economist Gabriel Zucman, who has done some of the most rigorous academic work on this question, has estimated that somewhere around 10% of global GDP is held in offshore accounts, roughly $8 to $10 trillion, depending on the year and the methodology. Others put the number higher. Switzerland sits at the center of that system, not as the only player, not even necessarily as the largest anymore, given the growth of Singapore and Dubai and other financial centers that have positioned themselves similarly, but as the original, as the model that everyone else has copied, adapted, and in some cases improved upon. The system exists because wealthy individuals and corporations genuinely do not want their money visible. Some of that is straightforwardly about tax avoidance, some of it is about political risk, genuinely legitimate concerns from people in unstable countries who have real reasons to fear asset seizure, some of it is about estate planning and wealth transfer across generations in a way that minimizes erosion, and some of it, to put it plainly, is about hiding proceeds from things that are simply illegal. Switzerland doesn't ask which category you're in. It never really has. The law says it can't. There's one more layer to this, and it might be the most revealing. Every few years, a major leak happens. The Panama Papers, the Pandora Papers, the Swiss leaks from HSBC's private banking division. Each time, the world sees the names, the politicians, the celebrities, the billionaires, the heads of state. There's outrage, there are investigations, some people resign, a few face legal consequences. And then the money stays where it is, because the money was never really in violation of anything. Or if it was, the violations are too diffuse, too jurisdictionally complex, too buried in legal structures to prosecute cleanly. The lawyers who built these arrangements were good at their jobs. The jurisdictions involved are sovereign. The treaties that would allow enforcement don't quite reach far enough. The leaks function in a strange way as a release valve. They create enough public pressure to justify another round of reform discussions. The reform discussions produce another treaty, another reporting framework, another press release about the era of banking secrecy being over, and then life continues. Switzerland doesn't even have to respond aggressively. It just waits, because it understands something that most of its critics don't. The money that flows into Switzerland is not flowing there despite the global financial system. It's flowing there because of it.
Because the global financial system, as currently constructed, produces winners who generate more wealth than any single government can efficiently tax, and those winners need somewhere to put it that is outside the reach of any single government's authority. Switzerland did not create that demand. It just got there first. So where does that leave us? The next time you read about another international crackdown on tax havens, the next time there is a summit about financial transparency, the next time a finance minister announces that the era of secret accounts is finally finished, ask yourself one question. If the system were actually being dismantled, would the assets still be there? And if the assets are still there, which they are, then what is actually being dismantled? That is not a rhetorical question. It is the most important question in global finance, and nobody in a position of power seems particularly interested in answering it.